A warm welcome to the very first Connect 21 webinar on uncertainty and change in planning and real estate dynamics, presented by the Urban Governance Research Network, UGovern. My name is Sarah Özul and I'm the project leader of Connect 21. And we have a very exciting program today, but before we jump into the presentations and discussion, I will provide a brief overview of UGovern, the Connect 21 project, and the idea behind today's session. UGovern is an academic platform to build, share, and communicate research activities in the field of urban governance and planning. The platform was initiated by Professor Tuna Tajankok within the framework of her chair of urban governance and planning at the University of Amsterdam. The main aim of UGovern is to connect academics, practitioners, and communities who work in the field of urban governance to create an interactive platform to discuss and collaborate on research. UGovern members each belong to a research chapter, which are named after the research fields in which UGovern members publish and collaborate, and today's event is connected to the planning and property chapter. Connect 21 is an excellent example of the types of collaborations that the UGovern network aims to encourage. The idea of Connect 21 stems from the personal experiences and work at the intersection of planning, real estate investment, and development of Nagwa, Tuna, Champaka, and myself. And together we set up the project. We observed several knowledge gaps between planning and real estate scholarship, failing to adequately incorporate insights from both disciplines, between planning and real estate practitioners, collaborating in urban development, but with relationships often being driven by misunderstandings, generalizing assumptions, and stereotypes, and between researchers on the one hand and practitioners on the other. Close collaboration with real estate practitioners is rare in planning studies and even frowned upon, and interdisciplinary and interprofessional knowledge exchange and networking opportunities are very limited. So the Connect 21 project brought together planning and real estate scholars, practitioners, and networking organizations. The institutional partners of Connect 21 and their representatives are the African Real Estate Society, the European Real Estate Society PhD Network, the Latin American Real Estate Society, and the Young Academics Network of the Association of European Schools of Planning. Furthermore, we have a number of renowned academics and practitioners who joined our project as individual partners. Collaboratively, we developed 4 webinars and 2 early career seminars. And today we are sharing the first webinar with the outside world. And lastly, I want to highlight that the project has been generously funded by the University of Amsterdam's Center for Urban Studies. To learn more about the Connect 21 project, please visit our website and keep an eye out on our upcoming projects and events, especially our second webinar on June 23rd. Today's session focuses on the effects of COVID on urban development from planning and real estate perspectives. COVID-19 disrupted established practices and relations between planners and real estate industry actors. So today we are asking, will there be lasting change in the ways in which planning and real estate industry actors interrelate in this uncertain environment, or will interdependencies soon revert to business as usual? Our first speaker is Kathy Payne. Kathy is Professor of Real Estate Development at Henley Business School at the University of Reading. Kathy's research focuses on sustainable city and regional development, governance, and planning under conditions of contemporary globalization. She is a co-director of the Globalization and World Cities Research Network and leads the network's global city planning research. Kathy's engagement as an expert has included the UK, Europe, North America, the Middle East, and the Pacific Asia region. Drawing on her interdisciplinary practitioner academic background, Kathy's research innovatively links social science concepts and theories to quantitative and qualitative data shedding light on dynamic social, economic, and financial networks and flows for public and private sector end users. Our second speaker is Dr. Fuad Malkawi. Fuad is Senior Urban Development Specialist and Spatial Planning Community of Practice Leader at the World Bank. He specializes in spatial planning, land development, and urban design. Fuad led the preparation of spatial plans and downtown revitalization plans for several major cities and city regions around the world, and has advised several governments and international organizations on urban planning and management affairs. Fuad holds a PhD and a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Pennsylvania, and a master's of architecture from the University of Texas. He published extensively and taught and lectured as an invited guest speaker at several universities and conferences around the world. Last but not least, our discussant for today's session is Alexandre Lamott. Alexandre is managing partner at A. Lamott & Co., which is a boutique investment and advisory firm focused on private equity opportunities and managers in the real estate and technology sectors. He has a 25-year track record in real estate investment management and has held influential positions with companies such as Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley Capital International. Alexandre holds a degree in economics from the University of Louvain and a master's degree in urban planning from Harvard University. His fields of interest is the built environment and the interaction between public and private sector. He pursues this as an executive committee member of the Urban Land Institute Belgium and by teaching urban planning and development workshops at the Executive Masters in Real Estate at the University St. Louis in Brussels and in middle and high schools in Brussels. Please note that this session is being recorded and the audience will be muted at all times. However, we encourage you to submit your questions and engage in the discussion via the Q&A box and in the chat. Now, I will monitor the questions and bring them into the panel discussion later on. You can also engage in the discussion on Twitter using the YouGovern handle and the Connect21 hashtag. So without further ado, I hand over to Alexandre.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this introduction and for introducing the speakers. So we'll have two short sessions by Kathy and Fuad. Kathy will start with sharing her views on the matter, focusing more on sort of high-income countries or OECD countries, and then Fuad will follow later with his views and experience in South Asia. Kathy, if I can give you the floor so that you can share your views, and I look forward to having the discussion with all of you afterwards.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Alexandre, and it's a great pleasure to have been invited. Indeed, the subject is very close to several of the research areas that I'm currently pursuing. Sarah's thankfully going to move my slides on for me. Thank you, Sarah. The subject I'm going to speak about, introduce, is whether we're seeing an impetus for new built environment directions, as Alexandre said, in high-income countries. So if you'd like to move on, Sarah. Thank you. So this slide really shows the picture pre-COVID, the forecast of where it was expected that high-income cities would be going. Very much an urban demographic, with 66% of the global population being urban by 2050. But as far as high-income countries go, 40% of global GDP being generated by 150 world metropolitan economies, with only 13.5% of the whole global population. So really quite a minority of people producing the bulk of the global wealth. And the combined economic output of the 220 largest metropolitan areas in terms of size in the world's low-income countries being less than that of just Tokyo. So quite a stark contrast. And you can see there from the graphic what the consequences of that were, that although 80% of that global economic output was urban, at the same time, those urban areas were using 70% of global energy and emitting 71 to 76% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. So basically sustainable economically, but not in certain other on certain other measures to do with planetary sustainability, and you could say social equity as well on the global level. But of course, you can see also top right there, this cycle of rural poverty as the world economy was changing that was leading to that urban profile. Thank you, Sarah. Now, some of the drivers behind what's been going on in high-income countries are to do with the network society. Obviously, the network society is not only confined to those high-income countries, but you could say that high-income countries have benefited more from the benefits that come with network society. So that's to do with information and communication technologies, which have allowed the intensification of international or cross-border flows of capital from one country to another. And a lot of those flows have tended to focus on the major global and globalizing cities, either in countries that already have mature economies or countries able to engage with capitalist production and produce more economic output by urbanizing and producing a higher qualified population to work in those urban areas. Now, of the drivers behind that, I would say with my mixed practitioner academic planning and real estate background, that commercial office real estate has been a major conduit in terms of allowing those flows of finance to happen internationally. A special class of built infrastructure, because it not only supports those capital flows in terms of real estate investment in that property, but it also accommodates the high-skilled people that work in advanced kinds of industries or business services, which are very dominant in the new world economy and which create economic scale in the cities where those people are occupiers of offices. So a very important role for commercial office real estate. But post-COVID, the question is, are we going to see an exodus of high-skilled workers of that sort to a very highly networked virtually? Thank you, Zara. So the pre-COVID focus of real estate and also planning was very much focusing on density. The project here that you can see, which I worked on for the Urban Land Institute and a global organization, New Climate Economy, Urban Coalition for Urban Transitions, we were looking at this image on the top left there of the idea that if you could find the sweet spot between good density, that would be a sustainable form of density, and how that would map onto low carbon emissions and livable cities, then you might also find that you found cities that had high returns for real estate investors. This was what we explored in relation to that. The diagram in the middle there shows a chart showing the figures for Hong Kong, which obviously is a very successful global city, even though it's arguable whether it's part of the global north or the global south, depending upon how you define those terms. But it had, of the cities that we looked at, the highest returns on commercial office real estate investment. It had a very high proportion of the kinds of advanced business services that I was talking about before, and indeed their high skilled employees. It was very, very dense physically in terms of its compactness and its towers not only of capital but of residential accommodation. At the same time, it had little open space, not very good green environment, and at the same time, though, it had low carbon emissions per head of population, but a high proportion of total emissions for the area. So we did produce charts like this for lots of cities. They were all what we would call global north type cities, in other words, high income global and globalizing cities. We found that not only were real estate investors interested in this trajectory, but it was being encouraged by urban planners generally as well, who for reasons of environmental and planetary sustainability were focusing on high density kinds of cities. So two mutually reinforcing dynamics then there from the urban planning community and the real estate community. But obviously COVID-19 has changed a lot of, made a lot of changes in this kind of density profile, or it's doing so at the moment, and we don't know quite where the fallout position will be. So we're seeing changes at the moment, as you might expect in office occupation, and predicted perhaps lasting changes in the levels and kinds of occupation in different places in high density cities, changes in retail, logistics, and residential as well. So perhaps there will be a change in focus on behalf of planners and real estate investors in relation to density. But I think that the important issue that this conference today raises is around collaboration, so that we can work together across the sectors to see how we should be responding to the dangers of transmissible infection in high density places, as well as non-communicable diseases. If you'd like to move on, Sarah. So finally, nearly finally, an important point here is that planning is not simply protecting the planet or the sustainability and social equity of the environment, but actually it has quite a conflicted and ambivalent role these days in terms of the politics, particularly in high income countries, of working together with the private sector to bring development forward and to create inward investment and, of course, economic growth, which we're seeing in the figures I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. So there's a political entwinement of planning and the private sector. And that's why there are a lot of uncertainties, as I said, around where COVID's going to end us up. But at the same time, we need to be aware that planning is quite confined to territorial institutions and scales, and that makes for complexity in terms of how it will get to grips with some of these changes. So working together, as I said, with the private sector is really important in terms of getting to understand what you might call the space of flows of finance, but also mobile people. Sarah, if you'd like to move on. So this is my last slide, really just to emphasize, though, that we mustn't be misguided by imagining that this is a simple north-south issue. There are huge differences between the two, and I know that Fuad's going to come on to explain in much more detail about that, particularly for the global south, cities which are very disconnected from the network society in some ways. And so at the same time, there is this idea not just of first, second, third world, north, south, but also of a kind of fourth world of inequalities, which relate not just to socioeconomic inequalities, but also to spatial inequalities, access to space, and also health inequalities, which are reflected in COVID. So these can persist even in developed world economies, and they can happen even in the middle of a successful global city like London, that there are certain groups who've suffered the worst from COVID and also suffered the worst from non-communicable diseases. So there are sharp divides that exist in the successful economies as well as those that are less successful in the statistics that we've been looking at. So I think it's really important for us to be aware that inequity related to COVID and beyond COVID is something that we need to address in the future between real estate and planning, and including politicians in order to think how we're going to create a more sustainable future. And that's it from me. Oh, just to say one last thing, which is the image on the bottom right there is the current project I'm working in, funded by the Medical Research Council, where we're working together with public agencies and also the private sector, particularly real estate, to try to dig into some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. So maybe if I paraphrase in 2 words what you presented. So basically, you started saying that initially there is a virtuous circle that has been generated by urban migration that has created density of talent, and that together is driving economic growth and development and attracts capital flows. You know? With the COVID pandemic that has now arrived, we are seeing potential exodus out of those urban centers, primarily because those people that are in these high growth, high income areas can afford to move and have the information communication technology tools that allow them to do that exodus and still be connected and be able to work. However, the other outcome of the COVID, as you say, is that despite the fact that disruptions may have been limited, the COVID has highlighted inequalities even within these high income countries. Yeah? So that's the big picture as far as you're concerned, and that'd be very interesting to hear Fouad, who will shed a light on what he is witnessing in other parts of the world. Fouad, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this really very interesting seminar. And I want to really begin from the same place where Kathy started, by looking at the world and looking at the urban actual expansion within the world. And we all realize now that the world is becoming more urban, and more than 50% now actually of the population live in urban areas. But I want to add another dimension here, which Kathy alluded to, is the fact that basically, let's say 90% of the new urban residents are going to be mainly in Africa and Asia. And also a very alarming statistics is about a third of the world's urban population live in informal settlements. And if you look at the map in front of you, you can see where this is concentrated. Almost 1 billion people living in slums, to be clear, to jobs and opportunities. So you can imagine the magnitude of the challenge that we are ahead, let alone the fact that there are going to be about 1.5 billion people exposed to cyclones and earthquakes in cities, in large cities, by 2050. There are now about 700 million. So in a nutshell, really, today what I'm trying to illustrate that while the pandemic brought in new challenges, it actually, most importantly, refocused the attention of city planners and decision makers on challenges that were often dismissed as not a priority against other items that are prioritized. And in that, from that perspective, I think new tools were developed for that. But my major argument is the fact that in what I call the day after, once we hopefully recover from the pandemic, city planners will be really facing the same challenges in these cities that they faced before the pandemic, probably at a little bit at a larger scale with more urgency to tackle them. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to actually zoom in on South Asia, although probably some of the things that I'm going to be saying probably relates to other cities around the world. But where I'm working now is South Asia, and as you can see, this is where some of the largest and densest cities of the world exist, like Mumbai, like Kolkata, like Karachi. And here, the informal, basically, settlements is actually one of the major challenges that many of these cities face. And the disease showed us that the largest share of COVID-19 cases were in urban and peri-urban areas. And the urban poor are particularly the most vulnerable, basically, people for the disease itself. To add to on top of that, actually, many of these cities have dysfunctional planning system. So when we talk about planning, we are not simply talking about really preparing a plan, which in many cases plans are obsolete in some of these cities, but also lack of implementation and actually resorting to traditional planning approaches that are not current and don't tackle major issues like the disasters that many of these cities deal with on a daily basis. So COVID came to add one more crisis on top of cyclones and top of earthquakes and other actual disasters that some of these cities face annually. We heard about the cyclone in India a couple of weeks ago. Last year, there was one that devastated Kolkata, and the flood that actually flooded Karachi with a huge destruction, basically in infrastructure and people's life. Just this diagram, I'm not trying really to make the situation look very simple, but this diagram captures a lot. We are talking about cities that are very dense, some of the densest cities in the world, but also rank low on the quality of living and livability indices. So if you take Dhaka, for example, it actually ranked at the bottom, probably only ahead of 3 cities. 2 of them has actually war. That's what made them really rank low. And if you look at Karachi and Kolkata and Chennai, also the same story, they really rank at the bottom. Karachi is one of the lowest 5. But if you look at OECD countries, you see that all of them actually rank at high. So from that perspective in the map that I showed earlier, it's not really about poor and rich, because Calcutta is actually has a sound and good economy. It's about really how do I put it? Certain management of the certain practices in managing the urbanization process that probably led to that level of distress in some of these cities. Just also to zoom in, basically, this is a study that we did 3 or 4 years ago on Karachi in preparation for the large portfolio that we are now doing in Karachi, focusing on improving infrastructure. And you can see by this really profile of the city that it is doing poorly really in livability, although it is one of the densest cities in the world, and it's doing really low on the provision of services. Our assessment at the time showed that Karachi would need $9 to $10 billion to close its infrastructure gaps. And I'm sure actually it's now more after the pandemic hit the city. If you look at actually basically all let's say services are probably below any standards that we can think of when they are provided. Almost half the population live in slums, or what is known as kachiabadis. Basically, water is not available for the most part of the day. 60% of solid waste is dumped, basically never actually reaches the dump site, let alone the fact that actually sewage is dumped into the sea. But most importantly, and this is where we began actually, is the fact that urban green space is shrinking, and it is less than 4% of city area. And actually that's why when we started working with the city, we started with that in order to show some actually quick wins where we can see that. Some of the analysis focus on that. But what I want to say is really COVID has refocused the attention basically on priorities that probably were not of that high for city management. Open space actually and urban space is probably one of them. It was not really considered among the highest in a city where you are talking about basically limited access to sewage, for example. And most importantly, the work in COVID also created a dialogue over things that are probably taken for granted. We talked about density and crowding, of course, a concept that re-emerged because of COVID. But also there were actually invention in creating tools for city management in order to help them keep up with existing challenges. So what do we know this far? It's my premise. I started with that the day after we recover from this pandemic, although there will be certain changes in our practices, the fact is most of these cities are still going to be facing the same challenges they faced before the pandemic and probably exacerbated in terms of actually size and the urgency to deal with. And these actually challenges are symptoms of the bad managed urbanization process. So if the world is going through a rapid urbanization process and we know where it is focused, then probably practices of managing this urbanization is what we should focus on and how we can actually improve that. There are a lot of ideas that need really to be that can be shared on how we can actually change our behavior. But for this session, I selected really 3 of my own observations, which we are currently discussing with some of these cities. First, probably the pandemic made people have some faith in planning, basically, and spatial planning became kind of a key factor for better neighborhoods and overall health. And probably the debate about what happened in previous centuries and how cities evolved because of health issues probably emphasized that. But the key thing is cities need to reform their planning system, and that is the challenge. The planning systems that many of these cities have does not account for many of the current conditions. It's not actually does not account for resilience, for example. And it is in many cases it is obsolete, and it is not more than really controls of land use and a little bit of capital investments program. It is mainly sectoral. So the key is really to come up with an approach that is more strategic and more spatial and more integrated. And finally, and this is a point that Kathy raised toward the end of her presentation, that development requires coordination. Different actors in the private sector and the public sector have different roles to play. And I think the awareness that the COVID brought now is actually the importance of this coordination. No one agency or no one entity by itself could have fought COVID the way it is being fought now in many countries, especially when we start talking about health. So from that perspective, each actor in actually the development scene has special role to play. The key would be how to create a formula by which they can coordinate. With that, I thank you, and I really look forward to the discussion. And before you ask Alexandre, this is Doug.
Thank you very much, Fuad. So we clearly have 2 quite contrasting stories here. From Kathy's perspective, although the COVID has had a human toll on developed and high-income countries, our concern is, well, is urban exodus going to shake up urban planning and the real estate industry? And although it is to a certain extent, we see that the systems are not falling apart and that information communication technology, amongst others, is keeping the systems flowing. Whereas what Fuad describes is quite a different story. Once the COVID hopefully goes by, the problems that were prevalent in countries like Karachi or Dhaka will remain, and the COVID will only have exacerbated pre-existing conditions. And so the question is, in countries like India and Pakistan are planning tools, the right tools to confront these issues. And I'm just going to share two experiences I've had to shed a light on these questions. Basically, what COVID has done to our world is it has created a huge stress test. I once said that if God were an urban planner, he would want to stress test the world with COVID to see how the humans coped with it and how urban planning and real estate will react to it. Well, I've witnessed two shocks that were not related to pandemics, but that were also a stress test on cities. And the first one is in my hometown of Brussels. Brussels has witnessed two shocks to its system. The first one happened in the earlier 20th century, where a major infrastructure project, basically creating a railway track in the middle of the historic town centre of Brussels, left an open scar for more than 50 years. And that scar was there for a long time and created indeed some exodus of the affluent away from the city center. The second shock that the city had witnessed was after the 1950s, where again infrastructure works and the construction of major urban highways within town also left major scars, and the affluent left. And to this day, we can still see the impact of that. Unlike a lot of major capitals of the world, the affluent tend to live outside of Brussels and the less affluent inside. And this is still the result of the shock that the city witnessed 50 and 100 years ago. Yeah. The other example I'm going to give is I went to Honduras in 1999 in the aftermath of the Hurricane Mitch that devastated Tegucigalpa, the capital city. The capital city had a lot of slum areas that were literally washed away. And planners came in to solve the problem. And what they did is they said, well, we cannot reconstruct these slums. These are unhealthy, unviable places for people to live. We are going to create new satellite townships for these people. And so they, on their drawing board, they created this perfect townships outside of the city where people could be housed in very good sanitary conditions. But of course, what these planners failed to understand and to see is that although these slums didn't offer the best living conditions, there was actually providing a livelihood for these people. Yeah? So these people were displaced, but a couple of years later, they left these townships and out of town and came back. So these are two examples where a big stress on the city had very different outcomes. One in Brussels, which still has effects today, where the affluent have left and have left scars that are still are left in Brussels today. And the example in Honduras, where planners intervened with not so much success. So the question I'd like to ask Kathy is, do you believe that this urban exodus we're seeing in high income areas, is that something that will last or not? And if it will last, is this something that policymakers and planners should probably prevent happening under the understanding that suburban sprawl, if we can call it as such, is something that is not desirable? So I'd be interested to have your views on how long-lasting this urban exodus we're witnessing may be, and whether it is a desirable outcome or not.
Well, I think I could probably make myself quite rich if I knew the answers to all those questions. There are lots of people who would like to know, and there are lots of people much more on the radar than me to answer that question. And probably some of them are actually participating in our conference today. But certainly the sound bites that I'm getting so far from the real estate industry side are that it's definitely still got a way to go to shake out in terms of anything that looks like permanent. And we do see conflicting evidence and conflicting views on the subject, even from some of the real estate industry people who've got their ears very much on the ground. So far, it's looking as if the prime commercial areas of important big cities, commercially successful cities, will, the sort of class A, for example, commercial office areas will have an enduring value and be used prominently, but perhaps for slightly different uses. For example, high tech seems to be increasingly important in London. The level of occupation may change. It's always been the case, in fact, from interviews I've done with business occupiers, that you go to the director of the office, who may even be responsible, say, for an office in Frankfurt and an office in London, and you ask him how many people will be in the office, in any one time, and he won't be able to tell you because there's constant movement and fluctuation. So I think that fluidity is something that may increase. There is likely to be, I would say, for some levels of staff, more working from home than there has been in the past, which means that there'll be more, I wouldn't call it hot desking for those kinds of staff, but there'll be more partial use of the property at any one time. But that may not necessarily have a locational change in terms of that property. I think residentially, we could see quite a lot of changes with more people perhaps being residents outside of cities. I'm not so sure about the sprawl element there, because I think they will very likely to be going to existing property. You've raised an interesting question, which is that if there was to be a bigger, longer lasting exodus, would that lead to sprawl? I'm not sure about the answer, because I think that it will depend very much upon the planning regulation in any particular one country that we're looking at. But I think predominantly this will be about people who've maybe already made something of an exodus and will just be going into town less. They may in fact take on something like an apartment which they use a few days of the week when they need to be in London. Retail is the one that is really, really dynamically changing, because it was already changing dynamically before COVID. But my understanding is that it's gone forward. It's progressed about 20 years in 1 year in terms of the revolution, in terms of going online with retail. That will have a major impact, I think, on mixed use developments, on the quality of life in central areas where there's been more mixed use development encouraged, both by the planners and by the real estate sector. Malls, of course, will change, but we have to bear in mind, and this is why, as we've both stressed, Fuad and myself, that the collaboration is important, because so much depends upon regulation as well. In the UK at the moment, we're seeing dynamic changes with the possibility of zoning, of new kinds of changes of use being imposed. We have to make sure that those systems of policy change and the planning systems implementation of those is in sync with what people are doing. People who work in cities, people who would normally live in cities, who would use cities for a variety of purposes, social, leisure, etc., etc. So we have to make sure that the planners and the building suppliers, developers and investors are all talking about where the overall city user population is going, how they're moving, issues to do with transport and so on, which has to be sustainable in order to make sure that we have a sustainable and equitable future. So yeah, I have no gift of foreknowledge, but that's my best take on where things are at the moment.
Of course, yeah, making predictions is very difficult. Now, from what you're saying, it looks like it's primarily market forces and market dynamics that are shaping the world in high-income countries. We know the real estate industry is extremely flexible and adaptable. So do you believe that in the examples that you have mentioned, there is a role for planners, and do you think planners have any leverage on what is happening by the automatic forces of the market? And I'll ask the same question to Fuad, of course, as to whether planners in countries like South Asia have a powerful role to play. But if we look at the situation in high-income countries, what is the power that planners have in the dynamics that are playing out?
Good question. So in fact, someone I interviewed a long time ago now, who was an American banker, who I interviewed in London, in fact, put it to me this way, that, you know, planners have their ideas about, you know, what's sustainable, perhaps to do with north-south rebalancing. You know, businesses are encouraged to go out of London or the southeast to some other city. And the way he put it to me was that it's a bit like sitting in a bath with a bar of soap. You put the bar of soap under the water and it will come up where it will come up. And it's the same with business. If it's commercially viable, that's where it will go. Now, that would suggest a very sort of unempowered planning group of actors. And indeed politicians, if that's what they're trying to promote. But that's not to say that the planning system doesn't have power. It is really important, I think, in terms of determining land use, what you can do with a property. I mean, clearly all developers have to be talking to and collaborating with planners to make any headway at all with a development, and that introduces risk and uncertainty, which has a cost. So the financial and the commercial and planning are very intertwined in that way. And I also think that, because, as I said before, planning, because of its political role, particularly in the public sector, planners are employed by, for example, local authorities in the UK, who are democratically accountable and politically elected. And then we have the national tier, central government tier, where you have, again, quite a short run political term. Then, you know, planners are also having to work with politicians all the time. And when that's related to economic growth or any other agenda, then, you know, they can't hold sway if that's not what elected representatives want. So this is where I think we have to think more in terms of hybridity, public-private with a hyphen in the middle, rather than seeing the sectors as completely separate. So I think in answer to that, I would say they must work together because of that hybridity and the link between what they do.
I guess if I were to answer my own question, I come from the real estate private equity sector, and I believe that because the baseline in our countries in Western Europe, for example, have been assured, health and well-being of the population is secure, the hospitals work, and so I see market forces dominating what is happening. And as you quite rightly said, Kathy, the private sector is often ahead of the game because they have capital and they have talent and they are flexible and nimble. But turning to Fuad, and again asking the same questions, what do you see playing out in the near future? Is it market dynamics, or is it primarily planners and planning authorities that will be able to tackle all the challenges that have been exacerbated and highlighted by the COVID?
So let me really begin first by cities, the way we view them, were actually already changing, not because of COVID, but rather because of advancements in technology, transport, and basically internet and all this kind of stuff.
But I think you may have to come a little closer to your microphone. You're cutting off.
I'm saying cities have already been changing, basically before COVID, because of the technological advances that the world is witnessing. And there was a lot of discussion on whether we will continue with the pattern of development that we are having in many cities around the world, or are we actually moving into a new era where probably basically we will be working in a market that is thousands of miles away from my home, basically. So I think that is a question that is relevant even before COVID. I think when COVID came, this was a test on whether a system different from the system we know in cities work or doesn't work. And I think probably for the most part, it proved that it can work. So I agree with you. There will be really more debate on whether we can actually continue living in cities that are dense, moving in order to be closer to our work, or better go into a place where that is much safer. However, there's a lot of literature that tells you about actually our attachment to cities and density that is removed from the basically the job and economic opportunities. Okay, so to get back to your point, I think the problem in, let's say, the world that I know is on one side, planners are actually kind of little removed from reality and understanding the limits of the domain that they are working in. And on the other hand, the market or the private sector is kind of directing and redirecting things with the capital that they are pouring basically into the cities. So this formula made most plans not really working. Some of them, whether they were not properly prepared or they were not really adhered or implemented fully in many of these cities. I saw a question where somebody is talking about the long tradition in India's civil planning. New Delhi itself is now finalizing their master plan. A couple of weeks ago, we hosted the planners who actually said the request was from the government was actually to come up with a new approach to planning that is more enabling and more strategic. And I think that is the whole notion of new planning or spatial planning, is the fact that to be more strategic. So the market will always have its really, how they say, its influence on how cities are going to grow and how they shape basically, let's say, the dynamics of the livelihood of the city. Now, what I was saying in my presentation, that planners need to update their practices to come up with a new approach to planning by which that actually their plans can be more immersed into reality and more actually strategic that can be implemented. Having said that, I also want to distinguish between the tradition that continues in many cities, which is the master planning tradition, where they think that they can actually paint the next 20 years with colors and decides where actually developers and everybody's gonna go, and between the pragmatic planning and the action planning that takes place probably on a daily base in some of these cities. And that second part is catching up much more at a much faster pace than the former part, because the second part is really responsive in the sense that if there is a development, can you hear me? I see that you're saying. In the sense that if there is a change in a development in a certain area, planners come through and try actually to somehow make the optimal solution for that particular change. But to conclude, really, the call that I was making, that in order for planning to be responsive and more accommodating, it needs to be revisited in the cities that I'm talking about, where it can be more inclusive, more resilient, and at the same time, more strategic in order to account for the economic and social developments that are happening on the ground. I think these are my 2 cents thought on the topic.
Now, if you again were to ask me the question, I have the impression that in low-income areas, planners, in theory, have probably more leverage than in high-income countries. My example of Honduras is just one of many illustrations, but at some point I have seen city authorities completely clear slums and displace thousands of people. This rarely happens in high-income countries. And so the planners can intervene and displace people and create new neighborhoods, but does that fundamentally solve the problem? Is the existence of slums and the high hygiene problems that have occurred and that have shown through COVID, are those not just symptoms of the socioeconomic fabric of these countries? And again, although planners have, in theory, a lot of leverage, is the problem not beyond them?
Yeah, I wouldn't, I wouldn't say really getting rid of the slums from cities is a target, basically. If there are no plans for what actually basically where these people are going to go, and actually many of the cities, the problem is it's not about really just cleaning the city and making it more livable for residents of the city. It's about actually dealing with, as I said, about more than 50 and 60 and 70% of informality with actually limited resources that many cities have. And I think that is kind of a different. There are success stories, for example, about actually how they dealt with informal settlements and the regeneration that took place in these places. But when the magnitude of the problem, basically in a city that has hardly keeping up with its own current infrastructure, as I mentioned in Karachi, there is a huge infrastructure gap already exists. This actually, the solution is a bit more complicated. Now, removing encroachment and slums might not be the planner's goal in many cases. And unfortunately, it solves certain problem, but creates extents of problems. This is happening in several cities at this point, where actually the political body actually ordered to certain areas to be cleared. So planners have leverage, as you said, but it's not really about income. It's about governance. What type of governance actually we have in certain places? Probably in democracies, there are much more debate, much more groups involved in the process of planning than in certain governing system where actually there are like few people calling the shots basically on planning. Is this healthy? I don't think so. While we are not talking about the governance system, we're talking about more the type of planning practices that need really to be practiced in these cities. They have to be a little bit more responsive to the problems on the ground. They have to be, planning regulations need to be brought up to date. Some of them actually are probably 40 or 50 years old. And certainly after COVID, they're going to prove that that they're more obsolete than they were actually before COVID. So rethinking planning is a critical issue that every city probably should start looking at. I know New Delhi started that before actually the COVID, basically. I know Kolkata is thinking about that. I know Karachi is thinking about that, but actually the process of doing it, it takes a few years. It's not something that happens overnight.
Okay, thank you. So we'll be opening up the floor to questions from the audience, but I just have one more question before we do that. And I know it's a question that is close to Nagwa and Sarah's interest, is do you see any gaps in knowledge that would need to be filled either with the public sector and the planners or the private sector and the real estate industry to tackle the kind of stresses that we've seen with COVID? What knowledge gaps are there that could be filled to help us address these challenges? Maybe starting with Kathy. Yeah.
Okay, well, I've got one example because I've just written a paper which is in review now, where, because I was visiting Wuhan at the time that the outbreak first occurred, although it hadn't been announced at that time, I got interested in what was happening in terms of transmission from Wuhan to surrounding smaller towns and cities, because that's something that's not been much looked at in the COVID literature. People have looked at the national scale and they've looked at the global scale with flows from one global city to another, because you have a lot of air flights and so on. And because other countries were interested in knowing how transmission operated in that way, cross-border. But I was interested in the regional scale. So in a very densely urbanized area, what happens when you have transmission through urban mobility, travelers going from one city to another, which they have to do for their daily work, and also there are social ties in that area. What we discovered with that exercise was that there was a very, very rapid spread locally within the city region around Wuhan, which is something, I mean, the statistics are so high compared with if you look at other levels, but that's had never been studied before. And what we saw was that whereas the government policies, and this is in common with, for example, in Europe, where it's been thought that you would get positive externalities from people traveling within a sort of urbanized region, and that's been encouraged with investment in transnational networks and so on, as well as within a region. What we found was that there were negative externalities in terms of health, and what's more, those negative externalities would then impact on the economy and on the social and the health of the people in the region. And therefore what change was needed was for the people who were responsible for the transportation systems between those cities to be much more have it on their radar that such an outbreak could happen unexpectedly, in that particular case, no warning, and that a more subtle approach to allowing flows to go to the places where there would be less transmissibility and better healthcare provision if you did have an outbreak locally, would be more sensible than just having blanket lockdown imposed across a whole city region, which obviously then has negative effects. So that was a very tangible example of how research, academic research, could sort of find some opportunities for the planning system, the transport planning system, and the urban planning system to respond more effectively to an outbreak of this sort. That's the best example I can think of at the moment.
Better knowledge of mobility and transportation patterns may have helped in this particular case. Yeah.
And related to place of work. So actually, and also place of residence. So having the private sector on board in terms of looking at those predictions would be very important.
Okay. Interesting to see whether big data analysis, which we are now getting closer and closer to through the fact that we can measure many more things, may help. So technology, artificial intelligence, and predictive models on the back of big data collection may help in solve some of these issues you've highlighted, Kathy. And Fuad, maybe if you can be brief so that we can still have enough time for the questions of the audience.
I mean, we actually, I lead the community of practice on spatial planning, and we just launched a new project.
You'd have to get close to your microphone again. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm saying I lead a community of practice on spatial planning, and one of the major projects that we are starting to do focuses on spatial planning and the spatial strategic planning in particular, and the need that came from the cities we work at, where basically the capacity in planning is limited. Now, there is plenty of probably literature on planning, but the idea of actually moving from sectoral and land use focused planning to more strategic spatial planning is kind of new in many countries, although it's been practiced for a few years now in Europe. And many actually countries we work in Asia and in Middle East and North Africa actually are resorting now more to spatial planning in order for them to link planning programs to capital investments, or let's say land use planning program to capital investments in a much better way. So I think this type of knowledge is not basically very rich when you look around, and particularly outside, let's say, the academic research, the knowledge that actually is focused more on enhancing the capacity of those working in the field on this basically is still shy, and probably that could be an area where we can contribute significantly. There are other topics also, but I want to be, as you said, brief.
So again, maybe the combination of big data analysis and satellite imagery may help in spatial planning. But as you said, the subject is vast. But Sarah, I'm sure you would have picked up some interesting questions from the audience.
Yes, absolutely.
So please go ahead.
We had great questions from the audience, and I managed to categorize them into 4 major topics: relationships and roles between planners and real estate industry actors. Then we have a lot of questions surrounding density and learning from the global south and learning practices, bringing them into the global north. A lot of questions on weak planning systems, specifically focused on India, and some questions relating to the new forms of inequalities that we see. So we probably don't manage to cover them all, but maybe starting with the first group of questions on the relationships that we are seeing developing or not. So the questions center around the idea that real estate industry should or can play a role in contributing to spatial justice, how public actors can make sure that the private property industry is not taking advantage of them, and the question whether the relationship is driven by ESG pressures. So can we expect planners and investors to play a greater role in creating social value in cities? So I think the overarching theme is like, what is the difference in the roles? What expectations can we have of the different actors? And what elements or drivers influence their collaboration going forward? So maybe Kathy, you can make a start on that.
Gosh, well, that's a very broad canvas of questions. Would you like to ask me one specific one from that?
Maybe start with the ESG. Do you think these environment, social and governance principles can drive the relationship between investors and planners? Is that an opportunity that also planners could maybe take to implement more socially just interventions in urban space?
I think to sort of come at that from a slightly different direction, I think that something that's been missing in terms of thinking about how to address equity and sustainable development is looking for complementarities of interests between the planning community and the commercial community. So the density work that I've done is an example of that, because what we're seeing there is that the investment industry, so Alexandre, I apologize for alluding to investment managers here, but investment managers that we interviewed were very interested in more sustainable density because they think about risk-adjusted returns on investment. If you do not have a healthy urban population, for example, if you have air pollution, or in this case, if you have transmissible disease in a very dense environment, then you're going to lose the value of the return on your investment. You're going to lose market liquidity as well, which is very important. So that would be an example of finding complementary interests between planners who are concerned about sustainable development and commercial investors. And I think that in the project we're working on now for the Medical Research Council, this will be very important in terms of what we find out about people's motivators. There we're looking in particular at non-communicable diseases, but we're also now, of course, because of COVID and it's happened right now, looking at that too. And I think that rather than regulatory mechanisms, looking for complementarities may be something that can be good alongside the stick approach. In a sense, the threat of the stick is the carrot, because if things aren't, if solutions are not commercially viable, they're not actually viable for anyone. We're living in a shareholder society where the public sector invests in commercial development and returns value. All of us that have pension schemes probably are unwittingly investors and beneficiaries of that too. So I think if we're living in a capitalist world, then we need to accept that we have to think of complementary interests as well.
Can I give my little piece of answer to this, or very
Sure.
briefly? I think historically, investment managers have been driven by market forces. They follow demand and respond to it, and they can even predict demand and respond to that also. But I believe that, well, I'm hopeful, because if you see what is happening in the public markets, the way the ESG agenda is penetrating the publicly listed companies, and those companies that do not have an ESG agenda are being neglected by the large institutional investors. I see that same pressure slowly moving into the private markets also. And so as much as historically the real estate investment market has been driven by demand, but within the constraints imposed by them by the planners, now they will also move within the constraints set upon them, again, not by the planners, but by the market itself and the expectation of the market for ESG values and policies. So I'm hopeful.
Could I just say one more thing on that? Are you, maybe you feel you can't say, but I just have a slight concern that the ESG agenda could be branding, it could be, as you said, playing to the market because it's an expectation. But actually, if it's not sincere, if there isn't, if it doesn't fit with I know you said it does fit with commercial interest because you can't survive if you don't do it, but that's a little bit different from actually seeing the real positive benefit of it in terms of direct commercial benefit. So that's why I suggest that I think there could be commercial benefits actually to having a healthier society. And if we could think about that, discuss that, and have the proper research to emphasize that, it might be something that was more genuine and sincerely meant than just, you know, ESG compliance for public face and branding.
Maybe a very short follow-up question on that. You were saying from a planning perspective, we might need less regulation, but focus on these commonalities. But then that brings me to one of the sub-questions. How can public actors try that they are not being taken advantage of by for-profit companies? Do you have any other ideas of like a framework that you need to uphold certain standards and make sure that social value is produced in the end?
Well, I can only speak from the UK perspective, because we do have legislation now that requires, for example, the public sector in commissioning to do social valuation. And I don't know to what extent that exists in other countries. Again, there are limitations to the data that we have available to inform social valuation at the moment. Again, it's something that we're working on in the Medical Research Council project. Economists at the University of Bath are working on that particular dimension. So I think it's very important. We're also, we have public participation on the radar as well. It's a whole work package that we're working on in that project. So I think making sure that the lay public and their views, particularly minorities, are listened to is really important as well. But I don't think there's a fast fix on this. I think it will take a lot of conversation between different stakeholder groups. And we may need to think more about representation of lay public interests, where the lay public are perhaps not able to express their views so well themselves. So advocacy planning and so on is another area which is important to look at. I'm sorry, I'm giving very partial responses because there are no immediate answers, but I totally agree that these are important areas that need attention.
Thank you. I have then a set of questions for Fuad, basically focusing on the learning and the good transformative practices, so to speak, that we might see in informal settlements that can be transferred to other parts of the world. Is there something to be learned from informal planning efforts in these settlements? And do you know of some good transformative practices that can actually benefit planners in the global north based on experiences from the global south?
So I'm saying let's begin by actually stating clearly that the lack, or let's say the problem, is not solved not simply because of the lack of solutions or the lack of even success story within the same country, where actually a city is suffering from informal settlements and slums and the challenges that are they're faced with these challenges, but rather from the whole dynamics as a whole, from probably cases where the lack of resources, lack of lack of basically appetite, lack of, I don't know, I mean, that's like problems are, let's say reasons are huge in number. So that doesn't say that there aren't success stories. As a matter of fact, one of the key things that we emphasize on when we talk to decision makers in some of these cities is actually to find those stories from similar places. I know it's more of a looking at stories from places where they have the same conditions. You remind me of a presentation that I was seeing in one of these cities where the presenter was showing actually inclusive universal design standards and was showing basically, a bus and how the bus cater for people with special needs. And I was joking and I was saying, what do you do when the place you're working in, there is no bus and there is no wheelchair at the same time? So I think there are success stories from the same part of the world or from the same place where actually of these cities that are suffering from the challenges that I mentioned. Now, I saw a question about Turkey. Turkey actually have a lot of questions. I mean, lessons to offer. Even India have some lessons to offer. Pakistan, there are cases that have some lessons to offer. Basically, Morocco has a few cases to offer. It's about the size of the problem rather than the absence of solution for the problem. I want to make a small comment on the planning side, basically, probably in the previous discussion, and I've seen in some of the comments that they are commenting on that. I think there are also in many of the cities that I mentioned, just to be clear, there are forceful and let's say clear legislation on what can and what cannot be done by actually anybody in that domain. We're talking about the absence of integration first, basically between the different sectors, the different basically parties investing and playing within the same field. And we're talking about really lack of implementation of plans in many cases. So the tool is there that can actually protect, let's say, the residents from the manipulation of any party, whether it's actually public or private. But at the same time, we are really more talking about how the various players can coordinate that. And if you allow me, I want to add that actually we are, I agree with one of the comments that we're not simply talking about investors and private sector and planners. Actually, one slide that I removed where I talk about the different roles of different parties, including community groups, including actually NGOs, including actually the various stakeholders at play. And so the idea is really, if we want to work on improving planning, we will need to get it to a level where it can be more inclusive, more consultative, and actually more immersed into the real conditions of the dynamics on the ground. That includes natural conditions and that includes also the market dynamics and all these kind of stuff. I think that disconnection is the serious challenge that these cities face.
I saw Kathy nodding. Do you want to say something in response?
Yeah, I just want to really echo what Fred said there. Urban development is a process. It's very complex. It involves multiple actors in multiple roles. So I agree with some of the comments I've just noticed in the Q&A, which is that this is not just for planners and real estate industry to resolve alone. Financial institutions, financial mechanisms, state taxation and regulation beyond planning, including planning, but beyond planning, government policy and politics, they vary in different countries around the world. And I think that in any particular country context, and as I've said, they're heterogeneous, we need to look across these to really fix these kinds of problems and come up with collaborative solutions. So really it's just to echo what Fuad has said. And I think that, I've done work also on Global South and some of the problems with informality in countries and poverty in those countries as well in the past, in my lengthy career. And I'm very aware of that and of the, the heterogeneity then of the situations within the global north and the global south, not just between them. So really just to say that I think that we need to involve more actors, including lay public, in terms of thinking about how to move forward.
Thank you. I will hand back over to Alexandre since we're approaching the end, but I will make sure that all speakers will receive all the audience questions for further thoughts.
Yeah, maybe a question on technology. Do you believe that technology, and I briefly mentioned it earlier, can be an interesting tool to these issues, and have you actually witnessed it in your practices on the ground? Maybe starting with Fouad.
So the key thing is there are, let's put it this way, there are so many tools, technological tools, that are available for cities to better manage basically the space. And of course, many are actually trying to bring them to bring some of these tools on board in order to help them coordinate and integrate actually developments in general. However, there is a common feature of many of these cities is that they really lack the database that can help. As you know, I mean, you mentioned like satellite images and all these kind of stuff. You know, the tools actually are very effective when you have the right database. So in many cases, like in Karachi at this point, one of the major things that we're trying to do is really to help the city to build an up-to-date database, basically. Not only for planning purposes, but also to help them become more competitive. I mean, to help them really assist themselves in a much better way, to help them manage the city in a proper way, do their own finances in a proper way, have a better tax system, and all these kind of things. So the awareness of the need of the importance of technology is there. It's actually the fact that there is a lag in terms of the database that is needed in order to make use of the technological advances that we have. In Chennai, they are now talking about really having more of a monitoring system to monitor all development on the ground, which is an easy thing to set up if you have the actually, let's say, the platforms available for it to function properly. So I agree with you. It is a very important thing, basically, to make use of the technological advances that are available and to build the proper really database for them to make a more informed decisions about what their plans are in the future.
Okay, but I think we can be hopeful that technological development is improving a lot and fast. So what we see now may not be predictive of what we will see in a couple of years' time. But Sarah, I think we're probably arriving to the end of our session. So shall I leave you sort of say the final note?
Well, I would like to thank all the speakers for the fantastic discussion and sharing the insights. I think it was a great start to our webinar series. Thank you so much for your engagement. Also, Alexandre, for organizing and dealing with the discussion. Very useful. I think we come to the conclusion that it's very difficult to come to a conclusion when it comes to what is going to happen after COVID-19 is under control. We know that uncertainty and change is going to stay there, and I think it's efforts like these that will help us at least move a little bit closer into the direction that we want to go to in terms of tackling inequalities, creating more social value and justice in cities. Thank you, everyone, and yes, hopefully I will see everyone in the second webinar on June 23rd.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.